A few months ago, some construction workers in New York were working at a new building site when they uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. And it's not just some old pipe or electrical cable. It was a time capsule from 1913 that had been buried more than 100 years ago. The capsule had been forgotten about until now, but what secrets did it hold? When the workers first came across the capsule, it was deep underground, and they didn't know exactly what it was. However, after carefully digging around it, they soon realized that it was a metal box that appeared to be sealed shut. With it being so old, it was clear that if this box was opened, it would reveal items from a bygone era. But where had it come from? In 1913, the area that the construction workers were digging on was used as a public park. So it makes sense that someone might have buried a time capsule here over 100 years ago. But why? Well, this question would soon be answered when the box was finally opened. After looking through old documents, the workers found plans for the park that showed where the time capsule should be. According to the plans, the capsule was meant to be opened in the year 2013, so almost exactly 100 years after it was buried. But since it's only March of 2022, it seems like it was uncovered almost a year too early. With all the plans lined up, it was time to open the box. But this wasn't easy. Despite it being 108 years old, the capsule was locked and no one had the key. Eventually, someone got in touch with a locksmith who was able to open the box. When it finally gave way, everyone crowded around to see what was inside. But these people weren't just curious onlookers. They were also the descendants of those who originally buried the capsule. So who knows, maybe they expected to find something special. After all, a time capsule is often filled with sentimental items. But what would this family find inside? While the capsule may have been buried over a century ago, the contents inside were still in good condition, thanks to the fact that it was completely sealed shut. This made it possible for everyday objects to last over 100 years without degrading. But what kind of items had been put inside? The first thing that caught everyone's eye was an old leather-bound book. Many thought that this was the most interesting item inside the capsule because it was also the largest. It simply said 1913 on the cover, which gave away the fact that it was the same age as the capsule itself. But what was written inside the pages? It turned out that the book was essentially a journal of the town in 1913. Almost every page had been filled with writings and drawings of people who lived back then. Some of them wrote little stories, while others described what their life was like during that time period. All of this information gave the descendants a better idea of how their ancestors used to live. But it was only the beginning of what they would find inside the capsule. Next, the descendants found some newspapers from the same year that the capsule was buried. These told stories of world events and local happenings from more than 100 years ago. The people who had placed the capsule in the ground likely chose these newspapers to represent what was going on during their time. However, they also put in other things that represented their lives, such as toys, kitchen utensils, and even tools. The reason behind putting these everyday items in the capsule was so that future generations could understand what life was like during that time. Now, the descendants of the original people got to see what their ancestors thought was important. But there was one tool in particular that stood out among the rest. It was a hammer, and it seemed strangely familiar to the people who had uncovered the capsule. But why? It turned out that the hammer belonged to the great-grandfather of one of the men who was there to witness the opening of the capsule. He had passed away many years ago, but his family decided to include his hammer in the time capsule as a way of honoring him. It must have been quite emotional for the man to see his great-grandfather's hammer all of those years later. At this point, the people were starting to think that they had seen everything the capsule had to offer, but they were wrong. There were still plenty of items left to uncover, including a glass jar that contained various small objects. The lid of the jar was stuck, but eventually it was popped open and the contents fell onto the table. Some of the items were too small to make out what they were, but the larger ones turned out to be buttons and coins. These would have been everyday items for the people who lived back in 1913, but they were now very rare artifacts. Buttons from over 100 years ago aren't sold in stores anymore, nor are the coins that were circulating back then. But there was one coin in particular that drew everyone's attention. It was a penny from the year 1913, which was minted in San Francisco. At the time, pennies were made in both Philadelphia and San Francisco, but the San Francisco Mint only produced them for 2 years. So this coin was extremely rare. In fact, it was worth hundreds of dollars. But the people who found it weren't interested in selling it. Instead, they saw it as a connection between past and present, showing that people from 1913 used the same currency that people today use. There were also some smaller items in the jar, such as old keys and measuring tools. But those weren't the only things. One person reached into the jar and pulled out something that no one expected. It was a small metal token that had a strange symbol on both sides. No one knew what the token was or where it might have come from. But eventually, one of the descendants remembered seeing something similar in their great-grandmother's house. After doing some digging, they found out that the token was from a local theatre group. This meant that someone from 1913 had either worked at the theatre or attended a show there regularly, but that wasn't the only piece of entertainment media that made its way into the capsule. Someone had also put a record in there, which would have been very popular at the time. Records were the main form of music, so people would have listened to them daily. Opening the capsule over 100 years later allowed people to hear what music was like back then. But this record was more than just a piece of history. It turned out that the song on the record was actually sung by one of the women whose family had put the capsule in the ground all those years ago. She had been a very talented singer and actress, and her record was included in the capsule as a way of paying tribute to her. By this point, the people who had come to witness the opening of the capsule had already learned a lot about the people who lived there more than 100 years ago. But there was still one more item to uncover. Hidden at the bottom of the jar was a rolled-up piece of paper. Everyone leaned in to try and read what was written on it, but it was hard to make out the words because the paper was so old. Eventually, someone unfolded the paper, and it became clear what it was. It was a letter addressed to the people who would find the capsule more than 100 years later. The letter was filled with hopes and dreams for the future, as well as descriptions of what life was like back then. It was a very heartfelt message that brought the past and present together. The people who had found the letter were deeply moved by the words that had been written all those years ago. They felt a strong connection to the people who had buried the capsule, and they were honored to be a part of that history. And if you liked the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more. This was Adam, and you've been watching your channel, Valley of Knowledge. Stay curious, and see you in the next one.